I want to thank you all so much for coming out tonight on what has proven to be one of the most beautiful days we've had in this long season. You can really see the end in sight, right? Isn't it? It's so good. I wore the color to bring on the spring. So thank you for coming to First Wednesdays. First Wednesdays is a program of the Vermont Humanities Council and is co-hosted by both the library and the Norwich Historical Society. The Humanities Council receives annual support from the Vermont Department of Libraries. The Historical Society and the library, we would like to thank our special corporate underwriters. The Friends of the Norwich Public Library, the Norwich Historical Society, the Jack and Dorothy Byrne Foundation, Ledyard National Bank, and Mastoma Savings Bank. I'd like to remind you to turn off any device you might have in your various pockets. And also, if I may just do a couple announcements, library announcements. Many of you might have heard about our tables of content literary dinners. Our first set of dinners is this Saturday night. There are 5 seats remaining for the 26th of April and the 10th of May. So if anyone is interested in participating in what will prove to be, I think, a zippy and fun way to spend a night, meeting new people and eating delicious food and thinking about literature, please contact the library. And secondly, the library is revising our strategic plan. And so we are looking for input from the Norwich community. If you work in Norwich, we would like to know what you are looking for and dreaming for in your public library. Is it a different service? Is it different hours? Would you like us to have more comfortable couches or a drive-through service window with lattes on the side? We want to know. We're asking you to dream a little with us and help us out. So there's an online survey that we are posting to our website and Facebook page and sending to the listserv. There are also hard copies of the survey if you prefer to do it on paper at the library. So the survey will be up until about the middle of May, and I encourage you to take it and to tell all of your friends and to share it with the town. So, tonight's speaker, Russell Rickford is Assistant Professor of History at Dartmouth College. He specializes in the Black radical tradition and Black political culture after World War II. His interests include American labor history and the history of education. A native of Guyana, Rickford completed his doctorate at Columbia University in 2009. He holds a master's in African American Studies from Columbia and a bachelor's from Howard University. He is the author of Betty Shabazz, Surviving Malcolm X, the only major biography of Malcolm's late widow. He is the co-author, along with his father, Stanford University linguist John Rickford, of Spoken Soul, the Story of Black English. Please join me in welcoming Russell Rickford.
Thank you to Lucinda and to the Vermont Humanities Council and to all of you good folks for coming out on this beautiful day. And especially to, oh, speak up, sorry. Yeah. Is it up? Is it on?
Yeah.
Okay. This is okay? You can hear me? I'll speak up. And thank you to, I see some of my comrades out there in the audience, some of whom I saw earlier today at a sit-in in Parkhurst in the administration building at Dartmouth College. So this is very apropos. And as they used to say, the times are changing, right? So thank you for your solidarity and for your support. So I've never talked to this many white people about Malcolm X before. But so it will be an interesting experiment. We'll see how it goes. I wanted to, as I say, I didn't have time to make it short. And my students know that I can be a little long-winded, but I guess the point is for it to be an informal exchange, and I'm looking forward to talking to you. And I know some of you have even had personal experiences with Malcolm X. And I was born exactly 10 years after Malcolm X died. So at that point, when I finish talking, I should sit down, and those of you who know more about this than I do should get up here and tell me about Malcolm, right? So I'm looking forward to interacting with you. So I'll try and get through this as quickly as possible. And if I'm going on, just do something like this. Bruce would do something like this where I wrap it up. But I wanted to just throw out a few ideas. This is very loose. But I wanted to throw out a few ideas about Malcolm and about Malcolm's influence, Malcolm's political influence. Particularly on Malcolm's political influence on Black Power, on the Black Power movement. And I guess that the title that I'm working with tonight is Malcolm X and the Black Post-Colony. Right? Malcolm X and the Black Post-Colony. So what are the ways in which Malcolm's ideological development, his political development, reflected this idea that African Americans were in fact a kind of colony, right? A kind of colony, just like the colonies of the Caribbean, the colonies of Asia, the colonies of Africa, and the ways in which Malcolm X's ideas suggested the possibility of African Americans transcending that colonial status and moving into a new kind of awareness, a new kind of status beyond this notion of colonialism, right? So Malcolm X and the Black post-colony, or Afro-American post-colony. So, and in talking about Malcolm X's influence on Black Power and also on this evocative idea of the post-colony, I'm going to focus on the last year of Malcolm's life, which is really the most, for many of us, it's the most exciting period of Malcolm X's life. It's the period in which he finally breaks with the Nation of Islam, right, and Elijah Muhammad, and sort of goes out on his own to make his own political path independent of the Nation of Islam, which had been his sort of public platform. And in this last year of Malcolm X's life, between early 1964 and early 1965 when he died, so he's actually assassinated February 1965, he undergoes a rapid political development, And the ways in which he develops, the sort of various components of his rapidly morphing, evolving political consciousness, really, I want to argue, lay the groundwork for Black Power, right? Lay the basis for Black Power, Black consciousness, and the rebirth of the Black radical tradition in the post-World War II years, okay? This last year of Malcolm's life, Malcolm has a tremendous influence on all the young Turks of Black Power, the young militants, many of them veterans of the integrationist movement in the South and elsewhere, who at that very moment are undergoing a rapid ideological development. And they're undergoing this development and evolution in concert with and in conversation with Malcolm X. So let me talk just a little bit about Black Power, and then we'll talk about the transformation from civil rights to Black liberation. So Malcolm X is the sort of acknowledged fountainhead of Black Power. He's Black Power's patron saint. And every single tendency within Black Power, and there are many tendencies, many political tendencies that were part of the Black Power mantle, right, in the late 1960s and into the 1970s, claimed Malcolm X as their patron saint, as their most important precursor and progenitor and inspiration. If we think about Black Power as a phase of the long Black freedom struggle, right? A phase of the long Black freedom struggle. I think it will be instructive. So if we think about a long post-World War II African-American mass movement that nurtured multiple approaches and strategies and philosophies, we can situate Black Power within that diverse movement, right? Within that diverse political renaissance, as I like to think about it. Now, quite often, in conventional narratives of Black Power occupies this sort of shadowy place, right? So, typical narratives, dominant historical narratives of Black Power see Black Power as this sort of moment of decline, right? So, especially, liberal historians writing about the Civil Rights Movement or writing about the Black freedom struggle, they may really valorize the Civil Rights Movement of the 1950s and early to mid-1960s, right? But then when it comes to post-66, right, 66 is the moment in which Stokely Carmichael and Willie Ricks, both members of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee on the Meredith March in Mississippi, introduced this phrase, Black Power. And this phrase becomes this electrifying slogan, right? It catches fire all over the country. And young militants start identifying themselves in terms of Black Power. So normally liberal historians will talk about Black Power as a moment of decline, right? As a moment that sort of ruptured the promise of the mainstream integrationist, nonviolent civil rights movement, the movement that's generally associated with Martin Luther King. Well, tonight I'm going to invite us to transcend that narrative, right? I'm going to invite us to think beyond Black Power as sort of a symbol of decline or disarray, of failure, of disillusionment, of chaos, and of violence, right? And in fact, I think that these sort of facile narratives reflect an oversimplification of the 60s, an oversimplification of the Black freedom struggle. They represent this trope of the good 60s and the bad 60s. And the trope of the good 60s and bad 60s says there's a good 60s and a bad 60s. And the good 60s is King, and the bad 60s is Malcolm. And the good 60s is nonviolent, and the bad 60s is Malcolm. And the good 60s is Southern, integrationist, and church-based, and the bad 60s is Malcolm. So you understand what I'm trying to say. We have to go beyond this notion of Black Power as this tragic error, as a failure, as a movement that squanders the gains of the civil rights movement, as an expression of bravado, as an expression of Black extremism, etc. So if we really understand Malcolm's gifts to Black America, Malcolm's many gifts to Black America, and in fact Malcolm's gifts to the revolutionary world, we have to also understand Black Power as a political, social, cultural renaissance. And as I like to say, Black Power as this moment of efflorescence, Black cultural, political, social efflorescence, of blossoming, right? Now, we should also say from the beginning that there are many ambiguities and there's much political diversity under the aegis of Black Power. So there are a number of different conflicting political tendencies. So under the auspices of Black Power, for example, you can get the forces of Black capitalism, right? And Black capitalism essentially means that there are Black nationalists committed to this idea of Black private enterprise, that the notion of Black Power has to do with sort of individual capitalist accumulation, right? So that's one of the tendencies within Black Power. There's also within the tendencies of Black Power this idea of cultural nationalism, which is to say that this idea that if we speak Swahili, if we wear dashikis, etc., that this is the critical path to liberation. Okay? And in truth, Malcolm X represented parts of those tendencies, especially the cultural nationalist idea, the idea of the valorization of Black culture. What I'm talking about tonight, however, because I'm focusing on the last year of Malcolm's life, which I'm going to argue is the most radical year of Malcolm's life, right? The most radical year of Malcolm's life, I'm emphasizing more politically radical elements and philosophies of Malcolm. So not just this idea of somehow Black capitalism, and not just this idea that Black Power is about a kind of a cultural celebration, although that's important.
I'm talking about a fundamentally anti-racist, anti-colonialist, anti-imperialist, and anti-capitalist, and also I would add the third worldist elements of Malcolm's political thought in the last year of his life. Okay? Anti-racism, anti-colonialism, anti-imperialism, anti-capitalism, and third worldism. All right, so let's talk about from civil rights to black liberation. From civil rights to black liberation. Racial liberalism, this idea that we can reform American society by addressing racism without fundamentally transforming American society, without fundamentally transforming the economic system, the political system, etc. Racial liberalism is one of these dominant paradigms of the post-war struggle for African American equality. And central to that is this idea of integrationism, right? That by mixing black people and white people, ultimately going to transcend racial barriers and achieve a multiracial democracy. Well, young civil rights workers in the early 1960s began to collide with some of the contradictions of this idea, this premise. And ultimately they arrived at something that, a conclusion that James Baldwin said. James Baldwin said, you know, I don't want to integrate with a burning house. Right? I don't want to integrate with a burning house. In other words, there was a loss of faith in liberalism, a loss of faith in liberal reform, in integrationism and nonviolence as philosophies and strategies. There was, very early in the 1960s, groups like the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee grew deeply ambivalent about the possibilities of liberal integrationism to actually provide African American economic and political empowerment, which was always central to the black freedom struggle. And by the mid-1960s, that ambivalence, that uneasiness with liberal integrationism turns into outright scorn for many members of the black freedom struggle. So we start to see, even in the early 1960s, a rebirth of black nationalism. A reawakening of black nationalism, which is the central political and cultural impulse of the Marcus Garvey movement, Garveyism, right, which reached its height in the 1920s and which was an international movement. Black nationalism essentially says that black people are a nation within a nation. That there is a larger nation, which is represented by the white majority, and that black people are a minority nation within the larger nation. And in fact, the path to African American power is to organize on the basis of nationhood. Very, very old idea, goes way back into the 19th century, even before emancipation. Some of the tenets of black nationalism include black consciousness, racial pride, even this idea that black is beautiful. A fundamental idea like that comes out of the 1960s. Now, nowadays, we tend to dismiss some of these ideas as identity politics, right? And identity politics is a bad word in the current political parlance, so you sort of dismiss it as illegitimate. But you have to, even an idea like black is beautiful, right, was critical to the reaffirmation of the humanity of the oppressed, right? So a simple declaration like the beauty of blackness was a way of affirming humanity in the context of a society that was devoted to convincing you that you were subhuman. Right? As part of this rebirth of black nationalism, one of the transformations that many young militants underwent and that Malcolm X helped to oversee was the transition from Negro to black. The transition from, and that is to say, an embrace of an idea, of a word, of a concept that had long been a slur, in African American life and consciousness, right? I mean, if you called a black person black, right, prior to the 60s, you might have a fight on your hand, right? I mean, the whole struggle was to make sure that white people said the word Negro in a respectful manner and capitalize it, right? That was a big struggle. So blackness, the embrace of blackness, which was central to the Black Power movement, again, starting in 1966, was a central transformation. And Malcolm X oversaw this transformation, not just from Negro to black, but also from Negro to this evocative and somewhat threatening phrase, Afro-American, right? Afro-American, which linked black people to the international black world, to the third world. Part of the way that Malcolm presided over the transition from Negro to black was in skewering the whole idea of a Negro revolution. You say, what the hell is a Negro revolution? I guess I shouldn't swear in church. I should also say that this is the first time in a very long time I've been to church, so the Lord works in mysterious ways. And in the pulpit, no less. What is a Negro revolution? So he skewered the whole notion of a Negro revolution. Malcolm X, thus, was at the very inception of what would be called a black consciousness movement. Black consciousness movement. He helped to precipitate a political and a psychological shift from the parlance of freedom, the language of freedom, the rhetoric of freedom, to the rhetoric of liberation. Now, that sounds like a synonym, right? The language of freedom, freedom now, right? The freedom struggle, to the language of liberation, the liberation struggle. But in fact, freedom was very closely tied to the civil rights ideal of equality, right? Very closely, which is a very powerful idea, of course. But as young militants started to question the status quo, as they started to raise questions about the morality, about the values of the white majority, they started to ask the question, why do I want to be equal to this society, to this civilization, right? This civilization that's wreaking havoc in Southeast Asia, in Indochina, right? This society that's practicing imperialism all around the world. And so there was an effort to transcend simple equality to really talk about the nature of liberation. And this was not just a semantic move, but a psychological and political transformation that was rooted in the embrace of the third world, the revolutionary third world, overseas models, from freedom to liberation. So beginning in 1961, after the assassination of Patrice Lumumba was the first democratically elected prime minister of the Republic of the Congo, right? The Republic of the Congo. And he was assassinated by Belgian agents with the assistance of the CIA, right? With the assistance of the CIA. And there was a protest in 1961 at the United Nations that young militants participated in which they basically had a riot at the United Nations in New York City to protest the CIA involvement, the involvement of the United States in the assassination of Patrice Lumumba. This riot, the importance of this riot cannot be underestimated. Because in many ways it announced the arrival of what was called at the time a new Afro-American nationalism. So there was a new theme of revolutionary nationalism, and Malcolm X was the ultimate proponent of this new radical ideology. Malcolm X understood that African American people, as a result of their long degradation in North America, shared certain psychoses with colonized people, right? So the ways in which the Vietnamese had been colonized under the French, the ways in which the Ghanaian people had been colonized under the British, and Algeria, etc., 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 that there were certain pathologies, right, that you internalize, that you absorb from your oppressor. Right? So this notion that there's a complex of the colonized was central to Malcolm's message to Black America. This notion that one must decolonize one's mind that one must shed the colonial mentality, that liberation is something that unfolds. It unfolds in the streets, but it also unfolds in the realm of consciousness. It unfolds in the evocative language of Black historian Lerone Bennett, in the winding corridors of the mind, that you had to free your mind before you could free your body, before you could free your community. And of course, this is very much in line with the work of anti-colonial theorists like Frantz Fanon, author of Wretched of the Earth, Memmi, author of Colonizer and the Colonized, etc., etc. Okay, how am I doing for time? 7:30? When am I supposed to finish up?
8:30.
Oh, we've got plenty of time. Oh, get comfortable. Oh, hey, no, okay. That's like my dream come true, Liz. All right. From Cold War parochialism to internationalism. I might have to skip ahead in a minute because I want to get to the end. But from Cold War parochialism to internationalism. So Malcolm X, above anything else, helped to internationalize the Black freedom struggle. He introduced the model of a fundamentally internationalist Black freedom struggle, or he helped to popularize, certainly didn't introduce, but he helped to popularize and revive Black liberation as a fundamentally internationalist project in the aftermath of the Cold War, or in the midst of the Cold War, but in the aftermath of the most devastating effects of the Cold War, I should say. And the most devastating effects of the Cold War had domesticated the Black movement, right? I mean, think about it. Du Bois had been silenced, right? Robeson had been silenced, demonized. All of these people were people who placed Black liberation in an international context and rooted it to the liberation of India, anti-colonial movements all over the world, anti-imperialist movements, etc., right? Claudia Jones, all of these people had been crushed, had been persecuted, their passports taken away, or they themselves deported as a result of McCarthyism and the Cold War. So as a result, the Black radical tradition had been crushed, had been domesticated. The whole notion of militant anti-imperialism had been suppressed. Malcolm X's emergence as a public figure, and as a public figure beyond the Nation of Islam, in 1964, helps to affirm this new model, or this renewed model, of Black anti-colonialism and anti-imperialism, of internationalism in short, as central to the Black freedom struggle. Okay? And this is critical because as a result of the crushing of Black radicalism and Black anti-imperialism in the context of the Cold War, the Du Bois, Robeson persecution, the mass movement, the African-American mass movement that had re-emerged in the 1950s and 1960s had been initially an essentially bourgeois movement. Right? Which is to say, think about the sit-in movement in 1960. These were Black college kids, right, in the South, who sat in at lunch counters. And this was a very radical move in 1960. I mean, this really launched the 1960s. Historians like this because the 60s actually begin in 1960, which is convenient, right? I mean, this is to say everything we associate with the 60s, participatory democracy, the anti-authoritarianism, it is all exemplified by the sit-in movement in 1960. But who were they? They were African-American college kids, which is to say they were essentially upwardly mobile young people. And one of the main impediments on their upward mobility was Jim Crow segregation. You see what I'm saying? So that was part of their frustration, and that's what galvanized them to launch a movement that actually radicalized the Black freedom struggle. But it was not fundamentally challenging the legitimacy of American economic and political institutions. Quite the contrary, they wanted to participate. Right? That's why they were at the lunch counters in the first place. At the same time, however, what else is going on in the world? Africa is undergoing a rush toward independence, and it's lifting the morale of young African American militants. Ghana in 1957 becomes the first nation south of the Sahara to gain its independence. And then in 1960 is the year things really start to change in Africa. 1960 is the year of Africa. So a whole avalanche of new African nations gained their independence. And so this increases the emphasis within Black America on solidarity with Africa, and it increases the focus that young militants are paying to the revolutionary Third World. Malcolm X, more than anything, embodies the idea that racism is not a domestic problem, right? White supremacy is not a problem within the United States, right? It's not a problem within North America. It's not a problem within the Western Hemisphere. It's a global problem. And you will never be able to get to the bottom of white supremacy if you continue to define the problem in a local context, or in a parochial way, right? This increases the attention that young militants pay to places like China and Cuba as revolutionary models. And this, the whole new left is undergoing this transformation over the course of the 1960s as well. They're looking for alternatives to Western practices. They're looking for alternatives to Western ideals, which they're now rejecting as bankrupt, right? As hypocritical. And in fact, they're even struggling to find alternatives to Western Marxism, right? Which is why models like China and Cuba loom so large. Young African Americans are going through an emotional, psychological, political transformation in which they reject the idea of racial minority. They no longer consider themselves racial minorities. They now think about themselves as part of a global majority of people of color. And a global majority that's on the upsurge in the aftermath of World War II. The colonial powers have been weakened, and it seems to be the day, the era in which colored people all over the world are going to seize control and finally vanquish white supremacy. There's a rising tide of color, right? From civil rights to human rights. Malcolm X says, what are you talking about civil rights? Why are you struggling for civil rights? If you were a citizen, you wouldn't have to struggle for civil rights, right? And in fact, stop framing your liberation, your freedom in the context of this corrupt society. We need to transcend civil rights. We need to talk in terms of human rights, right? And in doing this, he not only internationalizes the struggle, but he connects it to the promise of the United Nations, right? As a center of human rights, right? With the United Nations Declaration on Human Rights. And in doing so, he posits this alternative vision of citizenship, that ultimately our social belonging, our citizenship rights need not be fundamentally based in an imperialist white supremacist society, but we can transcend that model and we can look to a kind of a global citizenship based in the protection of our fundamental human rights. Okay, I want to interact with you. I want to get some questions, so I'm going to do a little bit of skipping, but not too much. I'm not done talking to you yet. So let me see. All right, let me briefly touch on two questions. One of them has to do with what I call a transition from colony to capital. From colony to capital. And the other one has to do with riots. So let me talk about from colony to capital. Beginning in the early 1960s, African-American radical theorists, inspired by anti-colonial theorists, started to talk about Black America as being, as I suggested earlier, a colony, right? So they came up with this theory of the internal colony. In other words, you don't have to go overseas and subjugate a people or a nation in order to be an empire, right? You can do your, as indigenous people, as Native Americans understand all too well, right? You can have that imperialist project, that project of empire within your own territory, and certainly that is the case for Black America. So this was conceiving Black America as a colony of white America, totally transformed the understanding of racism and the nature of racism, right? Liberals had said, after World War II, people like Gunnar Myrdal, right, and others had said that racism is a disease, that racism is a pathology. In other words, racism is something that happens when, for whatever reason, individuals are alienated from the essentially egalitarian creed of American liberalism, right? It's something that's messed up in their head, right? And they want to mistreat other people. This was a curious definition of racism. Malcolm X's critique helped to reintroduce the idea of racism as an economic, political, and social system, not as an interpersonal problem, you know, but as an economic, political, and social system, a system of expropriation. In other words, white supremacy, right? That white supremacy is the basis for systematic exploitation. What were the implications of this notion of the internal colony, Black America's internal colony? Well, for one thing, it transformed the way black neighborhoods were perceived. When black neighborhoods were perceived simply as ghettos, as places that were undesirable to be, there was sort of an implicit stigma attached to them. However, as a result, in part, of this theoretical innovation, this idea of black neighborhoods as internal colonies, many young militants began to think about African-American central cities, inner cities, as sites of underdevelopment and exploitation. And the implication is this, that Black America doesn't simply need racial reform, but national liberation, right? In the parlance of the time, late 60s, national liberation. Black power was obsessed with the cities. It was obsessed with developing a political theory of the cities. James and Grace Boggs. James Boggs was an African-American. Grace Lee Boggs was a radical Chinese-American theorist of black power. They wrote an article entitled, "The City is the Black Man's Land." This whole idea that as a result of the migration, the ongoing migration of African-Americans from the rural South to the urban North and West, that there would be a quote-unquote black takeover of cities, that cities would be the central site of African-American liberation, that racial concentration within central cities as a result of segregation would be a source of power and a sign of not just of confinement and subjugation, but of liberation. That in fact, African-American inner cities could become black territories, you know, sort of actual and metaphorical spaces of black nation. Let me skip the question of black rights, because I want to wrap up and get some conversation. I just make 2 or 3 very quick points. One of the critical transformations that Malcolm X was undergoing in the last year of his life was he was trying to transcend what I would call bourgeois nationalism. Bourgeois nationalism. And embracing anti-imperialism and embracing anti-capitalism. So if you think about the Nation of Islam, it seems very sort of esoteric to a lot of folks. But the Nation of Islam, then and I think in many ways now, is pretty straightforward American fundamentalist sect. You know, and in terms of its politics and in terms of its economics, in many ways it represents a kind of a black capitalism. You know, you got the little moms and pop shops, you got their grocery stores, you got the bakeries, you know, the whole notion of black enterprise and black uplift. This is essentially a bourgeois affair. I mean, you know, the Islam makes it, you know, for most Americans very sort of, it's basically a bourgeois affair. So Malcolm X was transcending that. He was leaving the Nation of Islam in early 1964. And his fundamental belief that the problem of white supremacy could not be solved simply through appeals to U.S. law, simply through appeals to civil rights, prepared him for a deeper critique of capitalism and imperialism. And of course, the expanding Vietnam War and his understanding very early on, long before King, that the Vietnam War was fundamentally an expression of American imperialism. Right? King doesn't get there until 1967. Right? Malcolm, long before that, is critiquing Vietnam as an expression of American imperialism. At the same time, by 1964, Malcolm is going abroad and he's meeting a host of African and Caribbean revolutionaries, people like Babu of Zanzibar. And he's understanding that anti-imperialism and anti-capitalism are inextricable, that in fact anti-racism is deeply rooted in this critique, or has to be rooted in this critique of capitalism as a racial system. And ultimately Malcolm says, show me a capitalist and I'll show you a bloodsucker. Right? Show me, and it's true, right? Show me a capitalist and I'll show you a bloodsucker, right? So in embodying this critique, he helps to dismantle the acceptance of many young African Americans of some of the Cold War orthodoxy that the black freedom struggle really needed to transcend in order to grow. So, for example, the Cold War equation of freedom and free enterprise, right, had to be transcended for the black freedom struggle to truly begin to liberate black people. Okay, almost done. From racialism to anti-racism. From racialism to anti-racism. At the end of the day, the Nation of Islam is in many ways a throwback to the Garveyism of the 1920s, which is to say Garveyism is a kind of a racial expression of racial Pan-Africanism. It's what they called at the time the Negro Zionism. So Garvey is interested, the Universal Negro Improvement Association, the Garvey movement, is interested in creating a black empire at the time in Africa as a counterweight to the white empires in Europe and in the West. It's not trying to fundamentally dismantle empire, by no means, right? It's saying it's a kind of a black Zionism. We want our empire too. And along with that, we want our black enterprise, black businesses. That's right, where the Nation of Islam comes in, right? When Malcolm X went on his Hajj, right, which is to say his religious pilgrimage, in 1964, he became a Sunni Islam, right? A Sunni Muslim, rather. He became an Orthodox Muslim. And when he got back to the United States, there was a lot of fuss in the media because it appeared that Malcolm had repudiated his racial ideology. That Malcolm had always been described in the media as a racist, and it seemed that he had repudiated this racism. Well, that's true. It's true to an extent. What Malcolm had repudiated was racialism. Right? Malcolm had not embraced American empire. Malcolm had not embraced white America. Malcolm had not embraced white liberals. What Malcolm said is that I have been to Mecca and I have seen people of all colors communing in fellowship in the name of God, in the name of Allah. He said, I think perhaps a bit naively, that if white people in America could embrace Islam, could embrace Allah, then the white supremacy would be removed from their minds, right? And they could be, now this is it's a bit of an optimistic vision of Islam. Maybe it's a little bit unrealistic vision of any kind of organized religion. But let me suggest that in fact, what was happening there was that Malcolm was becoming not less dangerous, but more dangerous to American empire. And this is why. It was a kind of an easy, it was a convenient narrative to suggest that it was the experience in Mecca on his holy pilgrimage when he became an Orthodox Muslim that had changed Malcolm's sort of racial outlook. But in fact, it's much more complicated. Malcolm had traveled throughout Africa over the course of 1964. He had met people like Ben Bella, the Algerian revolutionary. He had met Castro of Cuba. In fact, he met Castro in Harlem. He met other revolutionaries that in the United States would be described as white. Right? Would be described as white. But they were revolutionaries. And they were anti-racist. And they were strong opponents of American empire, of American imperialism. And he started to understand that there's no fundamental connection between race and politics. There's no fundamental connection between one's racial identity, right, and being a revolutionary, right? Did this make him less dangerous or more dangerous to the American empire when he starts to understand the link between white supremacy, imperialism, and global capitalism? When he starts to embrace anti-racism and anti-imperialism as struggles that belong to all the world's oppressed people, right? This is when Malcolm really gets dangerous, and this is why he has to be killed. Now, I think I'll end there. I was going to talk a little bit about, you know, the last transition was from patriarchy to, I was almost going to say feminism, but there's no question that Malcolm never became a feminist. I think he was very deeply committed to a sort of conventional patriarchy, male supremacy throughout his life, except for the fact that at the very end of his life, in the context of his new organization, the Organization of Afro-American Unity, he was exploring political relationships with a number of young, exciting young intellectuals, including Maya Angelou, right, who you've heard of. And in fact, he wanted Maya Angelou to run his organization, to run the Organization of Afro. So I would like to think that Malcolm was transcending that male supremacy that was so much a part of American culture, right, at the very end. And as I say that to say that we make a real mistake in thinking that Malcolm or any other historical figure whose life is cut short is somehow a complete work, right? Is a complete. No, that Malcolm was unfinished, that his transformation was incomplete. And I would like to think that if he continued to evolve, he would have transcended patriarchy, and he would have developed his anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist, and anti-racist elements more fully. Thank you.
Shall we have some conversation?
So I emailed you. I was a student at Colgate in the sciences and did a sociology program on Black Muslims, Black Jews of Harlem. And so I was in Harlem in 1964 and was weaving around and finding all kinds of people and had the opportunity to meet with Malcolm X. I met with Malcolm X. It was to be there at 9 o'clock in the morning. He didn't show up. There were all these Sunni Muslims running around. He was at the UN. And I stayed there the whole time. And you have to understand, I looked really young, a little white boy. He arrived at 5 o'clock and spent the next 4 hours with me. And I have a little bit of slightly different view of some of things. One is that the reason why he went to Africa is because when Kennedy was assassinated, he said the chickens had come home to roost. And that was brought a lot of bad press onto Elijah Muhammad's group. So it was Elijah Muhammad who basically said, Malcolm, you've got to get out of here. And that's when he went to Africa. And it was during Africa where he went through this transformative recognition. For instance, he would say to his African friends, you know, when those white guys look in your face and smile, but they don't look in my face back home and smile, there's a problem. And he began to realize that there was this racism was, in fact, international. And what he convinced me, and why I went home so excited, was that the problem of the 60s was not a black problem. I went down thinking it was all the blacks in all this problem. It was a white problem. And that's how he was transforming it, is that this, in the language that you use of getting away from racism to liberalism, is that we all have this problem. This whole international thing, everybody has a problem. And I was so excited. He was going to come up to Colgate. And of course, he was assassinated not by whites. He was assassinated by Elijah Muhammad's group. They assassinated him. There was retaliation. They blew up the restaurant from which was the organization. So I was there, and like I said, sense something was going on. And so it was really more of a threat, I think, to Elijah Muhammad's group than he was to American society. And it's really too bad that he did not win, but he was really on to something that made it so palpable to me, a little white boy, that, you know, I needed to deal with me. I didn't need to see him correcting his problem. And it was, I won't forget that day.
Well, it's good to see you. So, and this gentleman is also one of my homeboys, right? Because we're from the same hometown, right? Palo Alto, California. So let me speak very briefly, and we'll get some other comments on that comment and other questions. Let me speak briefly to some questions that you raised. So this idea of who killed Malcolm, right? Well, this is the murder mystery of the century, right? There's no question. I mean, it's probably even bigger in some respects than JFK. And ironic, too, that he should be tied to JFK in that statement that he makes in the aftermath of the assassination of JFK, was that late 63, right? Where he says, Elijah Muhammad, the spiritual leader of the Nation of Islam, has given his ministers strict instructions that you are not to talk about the assassination of JFK. He said, white people love JFK, don't talk about JFK, because if you do, you're going to make it hard on the Nation of Islam. In many respects, it's curious, right? Because the Nation of Islam had gained its reputation in black America by saying inflammatory things about white people. That's why, you know, most black people didn't understand anything about Islam. But they kind of liked the Nation of Islam because they talked bad about white people, right? So it was ironic that Elijah Muhammad would be trying to suppress, trying to keep his minister. But in fact, it reflects this kind of conservatism of the Nation of Islam. The Nation of Islam was ultimately about building its own little empire. But Malcolm X, Malcolm X couldn't help himself. And so he'd given a speech, a rather staid speech. And then in the Q&A, somebody had asked, maybe it was a journalist that asked him, what did he think about the assassination of JFK? And Malcolm said, well, something like, I think it's a case of the chickens coming home to roost. And being an old farm boy, chickens coming home to roost never made me sad. It always made me glad, right? And the audience kind of chuckled. It was a black audience, and they moved on. What did Malcolm mean when he said chickens coming home to roost? He said, as you reap, so shall you sow, right? That's what he meant. He said, what he meant was, and it actually was a direct reference to Kennedy's involvement in the assassination of Patrice Lumumba of Congo, right?
Wasn't it about Ziem, who was assassinated 3 weeks earlier in...
Well, that was also part of it, right? The assassination of Diem in South Vietnam, right? When the United States had use for him, when they made him their puppet, and he was an authoritarian leader, of course, in South Vietnam. When they didn't need him anymore, they allowed him to be assassinated brutally, right? But probably more fundamentally, it was a reference to Lumumba in 1960, right? Because Lumumba had been a real source of hope and inspiration for black radicals within the United States. And the assassination of Lumumba was a deep, deep blow to the radical elements of the black freedom struggle. And of course, we know now even more about the United States involvement, CIA involvement in Lumumba's death. As far as who killed Malcolm X, right? This is a big murder mystery. There's no question that the trigger men were associated with the Nation of Islam. But there's more and more evidence, and very compelling evidence, that either the local authorities and the intelligence community in the United States knew that the hit was coming and did nothing. Or were perhaps even more complicit, right? Were perhaps even more complicit. At the very least, they knew that it was, if they didn't know it was coming precisely that afternoon, and there's a lot of evidence that they did know it was coming that afternoon, on February 21st. So that's sort of a murder mystery, and that's for us to continue to research. Also, about the nature of the split with the Nation of Islam, it wasn't quite as you suggest. Elijah Muhammad's motives weren't quite as altruistic
or as fatherly in telling Malcolm, well, the scene is hot, you should go to Africa. Malcolm had uncovered Elijah Muhammad's infidelities, his rather prodigious infidelities. This was a source of embarrassment for the Nation of Islam. And it was a moral crisis for Malcolm because Malcolm had looked at Elijah Muhammad as a father, I mean, a spiritual father and a literal father. Malcolm's own father having been killed by the Klan when he was little. But at the same time, there were also political tensions because ultimately Elijah Muhammad was threatened and jealous, I think, of Malcolm in many respects. And so the chickens coming home to roost gaffe was a convenient pretext, I guess, for silencing him. And it became very clear to Malcolm that he was going to be silenced indefinitely. He would never return to being the national spokesman. Okay, I guess that's it. But thank you very much for your comment. And it's an honor to be with someone who is with Malcolm. Maybe later on you can talk about Malcolm's charisma and his sort of personal impact on him. Other questions, comments?
You made no connection between Malcolm's going to Africa and his disenchantment with Elijah Muhammad. Don't you think there was a real connection there?
Well, it depends on what you mean. When he went to Saudi Arabia and when he made his Hajj, right? When he made his religious pilgrimage in 1964. Again, I think that he used the opportunity of that trip when he came home to the United States to make a number of political shifts that he had wanted to make for a long time. And I think it was convenient for him to sort of connect these changes to the sort of religious, these revelations that he'd had on his Hajj, on his pilgrimage. But in fact, Malcolm had been to the Holy Land several years before, and so he understood the fundamentally multiracial nature of Islam. The Nation of Islam used to preach that only black people could get into Mecca, right? To preach to black American audiences, most of whom had not been overseas, and really believed. So that was part of the mystique of Islam for black, particularly working class and poor black American urbanites. This whole notion that here was this religion that had a black God, right? And that was so sort of fundamentally black that white people couldn't even get into the Holy Land, right? So Malcolm understood that was not the case. He understood that was not the case. So there was some fundamental sort of theological deceptiveness of the Nation of Islam. I mean, I wouldn't say it's fundamentally deceptive because they're a sect or a religious body like any else that has its own theology and demonology, etc. But the point is that he understood that Islam was a multinational, multiracial, multi-ethnic religion. But the point is that he needed some way to make a split from the old politics that was holding him back. He wanted to expand into a much more internationalist, anti-imperialist, what I would call a kind of a left Pan-Africanism. I mean, like politically left, like a kind of anti-capitalist Pan-Africanism. And he couldn't do so while attached to the old dogmas of the Nation of Islam. So I don't think his greatest revelations in Africa were actually about the Nation of Islam at all. I think his greatest revelations were about the nature of the world system, the economic world system, and the promise of the revolutionary Third World for transforming the African American freedom struggle.
Can you talk a little about his evolution with regard to the Vietnam War and to put it in the context of the anti-war movement just starting in 1964 and where he was going, where you think he would have gone?
I'm not sure where he would have gone, but he always valorized the so-called Viet Cong as freedom fighters. And in fact, he said something very prescient, and it's something that we need to remember today. He said that the United States can't win a war anymore. Right? The United States can't win a war anymore. I mean, what he meant by that is that, you know, the Western powers, the United States, they could blow up, they could end the world, right? But they couldn't win a war, which we found to be true. Right? And we found, I mean, we can end the world, but we can't win a war. And he said, you know, he said the Vietnamese are dropping out of trees in their pajamas, you know, and slaughtering the Americans, you know. And so, in other words, part of it was the valorization of a people's war, right? Of a people's war, of a fundamentally anti-imperialist war, and also a nationalist war. So it wasn't that he was committed to communism in any way fundamentally. I mean, he had deep critiques and suspicions of communism, I think in many respects, particularly early on. But he understood Vietnam as an imperialist adventure. He understood it as a war of conquest, rather than a war somehow of defending American interests, etc. And he spoke out quite explicitly about it. And he did so in a way that was transformative for young civil rights workers who were trying to understand the implications of Vietnam, especially in light of their commitment to, many of them, to nonviolence, right? And so Malcolm X's influence helped groups like the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, who also came out formally against Vietnam well before King did, right? And King came out, correct me if I'm wrong, historians, exactly a year, he made his Beyond Vietnam speech exactly a year before his death. So that would be
April 4th, 1967.
April 4th, 1967 in Riverside Church in Manhattan. Right? And he said the United States is the biggest purveyor of violence in the world.
Can you tell us a bit about the traction that Malcolm X had with black people in areas outside of the civil rights movement, outside of New York City?
You mean like urban places outside of the South?
Just beyond the place, New York City, where he would have been heard through the radio, or beyond that elite that was leading the civil rights movement.
Oh, I see what you mean. Well, see, Malcolm was a hero of the masses, right? So he was a hero of the working class. So that he was never fundamentally associated with the elite. As a matter of fact, he was always understood widely in black America and within the black proletariat, within black working class and poor people, as an alternative to the black establishment. And he spoke as a member of this long tradition of working class critique of black establishment politics. And this is why he was so merciless. He was so merciless on King. He was merciless in his condemnation and denunciation of King, because he felt like, and he said King was a chump. Right? He said that ultimately King was asking you to be nonviolent, to not protect yourself. And he said, well, this is clearly a counter-revolutionary strategy. He said, this is not, when they went to have a revolution in France, it wasn't nonviolent, right? When they went to have a revolution in America, the American Revolution wasn't nonviolent. He said, well, how the hell can you have a Negro revolution that's nonviolent, right? And when he said that to black people, this was transformative. I mean, it was absolutely transformative. And in fact, it was so influential that King found himself on the defensive. King came to Harlem in '63, and there was some street kids that was throwing eggs at him. Right? We're throwing eggs at him. In other words, and the next year, Harlem erupts in its Harlem Riot of 1964, right? Which is before Watson, 1965. So in other words, there was a real understanding that liberal integrationism, that nonviolence, that this sort of Southern church-based movement is not relevant to my reality as a young, poor African American in the ghettos of the North, right?
The irony is, though, that King in '68 goes to Memphis to fight for African Americans, garbage men making $1 an hour. So obviously, Malcolm X perhaps had some kind of influence. It would have been interesting if Malcolm X had lived. I wonder what kind of relationship they would have had eventually. And if they had both lived. I mean, that's something to conjecture, but, I always, that was one thing that was, as a student, people didn't want to talk about the inequality of America, about, economics. And we have that today. And I don't know where leaders are anywhere in America. I mean, President Obama speaks about it, but I wish that more people would be talking about it, because there's a sociologist years ago from Berkeley who said, it was like 15 years ago on C-SPAN, he said that the thing that is going to divide America the most is income inequality that King has talked about. It was just kind of sad in a way that our history is with violence and things like that. But anyways.
It's a good comment. And so Malcolm and Martin actually did meet once. They met in Washington, D.C., actually, I guess, in the steps of the Capitol, and they were both observing the debate over the Civil Rights Bill. And they met very briefly on the steps, and they exchanged a warm greeting and a handshake. I think King was a little nervous about it, because he was wondering about his image. But Malcolm leaned in and said to him, "Now you're going to get investigated." Of course, Martin had been investigating for many, many years at that, In addition, Malcolm made a trip down south to talk to some of the young members of the nonviolent movement, of the desegregation movement. And while he was down south, he was talking to, I think, some members of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, maybe some members of CORE as well. And he appeared on a stage with Coretta Scott King, with Mrs. King. And he gave a very respectful hearing to the discussion that day. He made some very respectful remarks. And he said to Mrs. King, essentially, look, I want to reconcile. Right? I mean, this was a moment in which, 1964, in which Malcolm was really seeking to what's the phrase? Mend some of those bridges, I guess is how they say it, that he had destroyed by castigating the black civil rights establishment throughout his life. I will say, though, that you're a keen reader of history, because there's no question that Martin was struggling to move beyond earlier positions, too. Not just with his condemnation of the Vietnam War precisely a year before his death, but with his long sort of grappling with the nature of American society and with the nature of capitalism. And ultimately, that you mentioned that he dies in the context of fighting for the rights of garbage workers in Memphis to organize. But he was also, of course, in the midst of a massive campaign, the Poor People's Campaign, where he was going to bring this multiracial army of poor people down to Washington, D.C. And this was not going to be a scripted affair like the 1963 March on Washington, where he said, "I have a dream." This was going to be a real occupation, if you will, to demand essentially a Marshall Plan for poor people. Right? So there's no question that Martin was becoming more dangerous to him, which is why he had to be killed. I don't know how we're doing for time.
Go ahead.
Maybe a couple more. Yes, yes.
Would you comment on what we might posit would have happened had there not been Martin Luther King Jr. and his nonviolent movement, where Malcolm X would have started and where he would have gone and how he would have gone at what he did?
Oh, if Malcolm didn't have Martin as a kind of foil? I thought you were going to ask me what would have happened if there wasn't a Martin period. And my answer would have been the exact same thing would have happened. In other words, I know this is not the question that you asked, but I'm just going to take this opportunity to, in other words, and I just had this conversation with one of my classes last term. I taught a class on civil rights, and the young people, because of the way in which we've taught the civil rights movement, are really infatuated with this idea of charisma and charismatic leadership. And so they sort of bemoan, no, we don't have leaders today. Well, we always have charismatic people. We always have people who can get up and make a speech. And we always, more importantly, there's always people, individuals, who can, Gramsci called them organic intellectuals, people who can articulate the fundamental ideals and aspirations of the oppressed people that they represent, right? We always have those people. Now, Martin was very, very good. I mean, he was very eloquent. He was very handsome. He was very charismatic. He knew how to work a crowd. He was brilliant, right? But people who really think of Martin as anomalous have not been to black churches. You got to go to some black churches. If you go to a black church on Sunday, you can swing a cat and hit a minister who has the kind of oratorical prowess and power that Martin did. Now let me try and answer the question you actually asked. What would have happened if there had been no Malcolm? It's interesting because they were very useful in some respects politically to each other, right? Which I think maybe is what you're getting at, which is a brilliant question. I don't know. Martin could always say to white liberals, look, implicitly, look, if you don't deal with me, there's this guy, And by the same token, Malcolm, he used to revel in, he relished skewering Martin because Martin was such a symbol of the mainstream sort of black political establishment, even though he had real tensions with other leaders of the NAACP and Urban League, etc. He's such an embodiment of nonviolence, of this idea of nonviolence, of this idea that unredeemed suffering, or undeserved suffering, rather, is redemptive, right? And Malcolm used to whip black audiences, especially in the inner city, into a frenzy, absolutely decimating, the whole intellectual and philosophical basis for that. Which is to say, in short, the reason why black people love Malcolm, one of the reasons why black people love Malcolm, is that Malcolm said stuff in public that black people always said to one another behind closed doors. I mean, he said it, and he said it out loud, and he said it right in white America's face. And do you understand, for people, right, that had been systematically oppressed for all of these generations, that had learned, that had learned to be strategic and to swallow your word and to smile and to grit your teeth? He said no, right? That we have a reason to be angry, and we're going to tell white America exactly how angry we are. And that was transformative. So I think that's a big part of the reason why black people love Malcolm.
So, did his assassination make a difference? I mean, had he already gotten the ball rolling enough in terms of black power that kept going, or what about that?
Well, I think that the way he was trying to get the ball rolling on, among other things, he was trying to take the United States before the United Nations and have the United States charged with human rights violations based on its treatment of black people, which is not an idea he came up with. This is actually a relatively old idea. It was tried in the 1940s, it was tried in the early 1950s by the Civil Rights Congress. But it reflected his commitment to human rights and his commitment to internationalizing the struggle. Part of what he was doing, he was on a political mission when he was in Africa. He spent most of 1964 overseas. And I should also say, having done a book about his widow, Betty Shabazz, he was probably a pretty horrible husband, I mean, for a number of reasons. I mean, I think he was a really loving person. I'm not sure they were in love, but there's a lot of evidence that perhaps they weren't really in love, that it was a marriage of convenience. But he was always gone, you know, he was always gone. But in any case, he spent most of 1964 overseas on a political mission trying to meet with African leaders, people like Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana and others, trying to build support for Black America, for the Black American struggle, and specifically for his crusade to have the United States charged with human rights abuse. Now, in hindsight, it was pretty naive. What he didn't understand, well, he didn't understand a number of things. He didn't recognize the extent to which new African nations were beholden to the left, to the west, the opposite, were beholden to the west. And what he called U.S. dollarism was going to undermine his attempt to build this Black diasporic and African coalition, a moral and political coalition condemning white supremacy and Western imperialism. He also, probably because of the moment in which he died in 1965, he hadn't fully grasped the tragedy of the post-colonial moment in Africa, the Caribbean, throughout the Black world, which is to say that many of those heroic nationalist leaders became authoritarian leaders, right? Became really anti-democratic figures. And so, I don't know, I can speculate that if he lived, he would have had to grapple with that reality, because ultimately Malcolm was committed to human liberation, he was committed to human rights. And he would not have made a compromise, political compromise, with figures who ultimately were foes of human rights and fundamental liberation. So I think we're probably drawing short on time, right?
Around 8:30.
Okay.
Time for a couple more questions.
Okay. All right. Okay. Sure.
I want to ask, where are we at now? Given the 99 and 1 cent, given the economic inequities that we know of, given the rate of incarceration of Black people, just given the facts of life today, where are we?
Well, I'd like to think that we're on the brink. I mean, I was about to say we're on the precipice. We're probably both on the precipice and on the brink. We'll have to wait and see. But I think that we're on the brink. I mean, in fact, and I alluded to earlier that some of us were participating in some protests earlier at Dartmouth College. Well, Dartmouth College is in many ways an unlikely place for there to be an occupation of the administration building. There was an occupation of the administration building. In fact, as far as I know, it's going on right now. I think that there's a real hunger, there's a real craving, there's a real questioning. Even the kind of students that we teach at Dartmouth, which I believe, by and large, are generally fairly conformist students. I mean, they're obedient, by and large, really asking questions. And part of it is sort of anxiety. I mean, they understand that the economy, they've sort of seen, I was telling them, well, you've seen capitalism collapse, so I mean, but they understand, they feel that anxiety, and they have that sort of, some of them at least, a kind of, they feel somewhat insecure about the state of the economy, etc. But beyond that, some of them are starting to ask some fundamental questions about the nature of our society, about what is sustainable and what is not sustainable. And I think that maybe our task as teachers, right, is simply to encourage those questions, right? It's simply to encourage the questions. And by the strength of our own example in our own lives, in whatever ways we can, to embody the possibilities of change, of transformation. And to fight despair and to remain hopeful, remain fixed on a vision of human justice, right? That will liberate all people. And I think central to that vision and central to our task today has to be the liberation of Palestine. I think that it has to be the liberation of Palestine. I think that Palestine is the South Africa of our time. I mean, it's the South Africa of the moment, right? So if we really want a vision of human liberation, we have to free the colonized people of Palestine. So maybe we should end here. Thank you very much.